close your eyes and let your mind drift back over 2,000 years, to a time when the Mediterranean world trembled at the whisper of a single name, Hannibal. Feel the gentle evening breeze that once carried the scent of cedar and salt across ancient harbours, where purple-sailed ships rocked softly against stone quays and the last rays of sunset painted marble columns gold. Tonight, we journey together through one of history's most extraordinary tales of revenge, a story that began with a child's sacred promise and ended with an empire's transformation. This is the tale of a man who swore an oath that would echo through eternity, who led elephants across impossible mountains, who brought terror to the gates of Rome itself, and who discovered that even perfect vengeance can become its own prison. As you settle into comfort, let the rhythm of this ancient story carry you toward peaceful sleep. Imagine the soft lapping of waves against Carthaginian shores, the distant sound of temple bells, and the whispered conversations of those who lived when the world was young and full of possibility. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these calming historical journeys, subscribe for more bedtime stories from the past, and share in the comments which legendary figure you'd like to hear about next. Now, let us sail back to where it all began. In the gentle twilight of the ancient world, when God still walked among mortals and the Mediterranean was a lake of endless possibility, Phoenician traders set sail from the purple-dyed ports of Tyre and Sidon. Their ships, laden with precious cargo and dreams of prosperity, rode the evening swells like seabirds returning home. It was these merchants, with their weathered hands and salt-stained robes, who would plant the seeds of what would become the greatest maritime empire the world had ever known. Picture, if you will, a crescent bay on the North African coast, where the morning sun painted the water silver and gold. Here, in the year 814 BCE, a Phoenician princess named Dido stepped onto sandy shores with her followers, carrying nothing but hope and the sacred fire of her homeland. The local Berber king, Iarbas, had agreed to sell her only as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. But Dido, with the cunning that would mark her people's character for centuries, cut that hide into the thinnest possible strips and encircled a hill overlooking the sea. This was Bursa Hill, the beating heart of what would become Carthage, the new city known to history as Carthage. In the peaceful evenings that followed, you might have heard the gentle sound of hammers on stone as the first houses took shape, the soft voices of children playing in narrow streets, and the distant call of merchants hawking their wares in the growing marketplace. The Carthaginians were a people of the sea, as comfortable on rolling waves as others were on solid ground. Their ships, with their distinctive curved prows and eyes painted on the hull to ward off evil spirits, carried amber from the Baltic, tin from distant Britain, and silk from mysterious lands beyond the sunrise. In the great circular harbour they carved from living rock, you could hear the gentle creaking of ropes and the splash of oars as crews prepared for journeys that might last months or years. But Carthage was more than mere commerce. In the temples dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon, incense burned continuously, sending sweet smoke toward heaven while priests chanted in the ancient tongue. The Carthaginians believed deeply in fate and the favour of the gods, perhaps sensing even then that their destiny would be written in conflict with powers they could barely imagine. Children grew up speaking not just Punic, but Greek, Egyptian, and the tongues of a dozen tribes. In the evening schools, young voices recited not just accounts and inventories, but the epic poems of distant lands, the wisdom of Egyptian scribes, and the mathematical principles that made navigation possible. This was a civilization that thrived on diversity, on the patient accumulation of knowledge from every corner of the known world. As generations passed, Carthage grew from trading post to city-state to empire. Her influence spread along the African coast, across to Sardinia and Corsica, and most importantly, to the rich silver mines of Spain. The Carthaginian navy, with its massive quinquerines and their bronze rams, became the mistress of the western Mediterranean. No merchant ship sailed without permission, no coastal city prospered without acknowledging Carthaginian authority. Yet even in these golden years, there were whispers of trouble from the east. Roman merchants, their Latin harsh compared to the melodic Punic tongue, began appearing in greater numbers. Roman ships, at first small and clumsy compared to Carthaginian vessels, slowly grew larger and more confident. The two powers signed treaties, dividing the Mediterranean between them like two neighbours agreeing on a fence line. But fences, as any farmer knows, are built to be crossed. In the markets of Carthage, old traders who had seen the world slowly began to speak of a new kind of people rising across the water. These Romans, they said, were different from the Greeks with their philosophy and art, different from the Egyptians with their ancient wisdom. The Romans built roads straight as spear shafts, organised their armies like clockwork, and seemed to possess an endless hunger for land and glory. As the 3rd century before Christ dawned, young Hannibal Barca would stand on Carthage's highest tower, watching the sunrise paint the sea crimson and gold. Sometimes, on the clearest mornings, he could make out the dark smudge on the northern horizon that was Sicily, where Carthaginian and Roman interests were beginning to clash like two great waves meeting in a narrow strait. The peaceful morning sounds of his beloved city, the call of vendors, the laughter of children, the gentle splash of oars in the harbour, carried on the breeze like a lullaby. But Hamilcar's trained ear could detect something else in the wind. The distant sound of marching feet, the creak of ship timbers under strain, and the whispered prayers of mothers whose sons might soon march to war. History was stirring from its gentle sleep, and the age of innocence was drawing to a close. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Carthage lay wrapped in the soft embrace of Mediterranean mist, young Hannibal would often wake to find his father already gone. Hannibal Barca, the Lion of Carthage, had little time for the gentle rhythms of domestic life. The First Punic War had ended in bitter defeat, and the taste of that humiliation lingered in his mouth like ashes from a funeral pyre. Picture the boy, perhaps 9 years old, with the dark eyes and olive skin of his people, padding barefoot through the marble corridors of the family villa. The walls were decorated with frescoes depicting Carthaginian victories of old, ships ramming through enemy lines, elephants trampling barbarian warriors, and generals receiving the submission of conquered cities. But these images of glory seemed to mock the present reality, where Carthage had been forced to pay tribute to Rome and surrender her beloved Sicily. When father and son did walk together through the city, usually in the cool evening hours, Hamilcar's weathered hand would rest gently on the boy's shoulder as he pointed out the changes that defeat had brought. Here, where once stood a proud statue of Melkart, the Carthaginian Hercules, now there was empty space. The bronze soul to help pay the crushing indemnity Rome had demanded. There in the harbour, fewer ships bobbed at anchor, their crews dispersed or pressed into other service. "A Barca never forgets," Hamilcar would murmur, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "We remember every kindness, every slight, every drop of blood spilled for our people." His eyes, grey as a stormy sea, would fix on some distant point beyond the horizon. "And we repay our debts, my son, all of them." The education of a Carthaginian noble's son was thorough and unforgiving. While Roman boys his age played with wooden swords in their father's gardens, Hannibal studied languages with Syrian tutors, mathematics with Egyptian priests, and strategy with veteran officers who had fought from Spain to Sicily. His small fingers traced the coastlines on detailed maps, while grizzled sergeants spoke of wind patterns, supply lines, and the psychology of different peoples. But it was not just academic knowledge that filled the boy's days. In the pre-dawn darkness, he would join his father's training sessions, learning to handle sword and spear, to read the subtle signs that betrayed an enemy's intentions, and to command respect from men twice his age and 3 times his size. The other officers' sons watched with a mixture of envy and awe as young Hannibal absorbed lessons that most would not encounter until they had grey in their beards. The turning point came on a day that began like any other. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the family shrine, illuminating the sacred objects that connected the Barca family to their ancestors and their gods. Hamilcar stood before the altar, dressed in his finest robes, while household slaves arranged offerings of honey, wine, and incense. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and the anticipation of something momentous. "Today, my son," Hamilcar said, his voice unusually formal, "you will learn what it means to be a Barca." He gestured toward the altar, where a ceremonial dagger lay beside a cup of wine mixed with the boy's own blood, a tiny cut on his palm that had already begun to heal. "Place your hand upon the sacred stone." Hannibal's small palm pressed against the ancient basalt, still warm from the morning sun that streamed through the shrine's open roof. The stone was older than Carthage itself, carried from the homeland in Phoenicia when the first colonists had sailed west toward their destiny. Generations of his ancestors had touched this same surface, binding themselves to oaths that transcended individual life and death. "Swear," his father commanded, and there was something terrible and beautiful in his voice, like the sound of wind through a sword blade. "Swear by Tanit and Baal Hamon, by the shades of your ancestors and the hopes of your descendants, that you will never be a friend to Rome. Swear that as long as breath remains in your body, you will work for the destruction of our enemies. Let this oath be written not in bronze or stone, but in the very substance of your soul." The words came from the boy's lips with surprising strength, as if they had been waiting there all his life. "I swear by all the gods of my people and the sacred fire of my ancestors, I will never be Rome's friend. I will devote my life to her destruction, and I will teach my sons to hate her name as I have learned to hate it." The moment the oath left his lips, something changed in the air around them. The incense smoke seemed to spiral upward with new purpose, and the golden light streaming through the shrine's opening appeared to pulse with divine approval. Hamilcar's stern features softened for just an instant, and he placed both hands on his son's shoulders with infinite gentleness. "Now you understand," he whispered, "the weight that you will carry. This is not merely personal hatred, my child. This is justice delayed, vengeance postponed, but never abandoned. The humiliation of our people cries out for balance, and the gods have chosen our family to be their instruments." In the years that followed, that sacred moment would return to Hannibal in quiet times, during long marches through hostile territory, in the silence before great battles, and in the lonely hours when command isolated him from all human comfort. The weight of the oath never diminished. If anything, it grew heavier as he came to understand the full magnitude of what he had promised. The boy who had sworn that oath was gone forever, replaced by something harder and more focused. When other children played, Hannibal studied. When they slept, he trained. When they dreamed of simple pleasures, he dreamed of Roman legions broken on foreign soil, and the purple banners of Carthage flying once again over Sicily's golden shores. But perhaps the heaviest burden was not the oath itself, but the love that had prompted it. For Hamilcar Barca loved his son more than his own life, and in binding the boy to this course of revenge, he had also bound him to a destiny that would allow little room for personal happiness, for the gentle pleasures of family life, or for the quiet satisfactions of peaceful old age. As father and son walked home through Carthage's evening streets, past the fountains where water played in endless patterns, and the gardens where night-blooming jasmine released its perfume into the cooling air, they moved like two ghosts haunted by the same beautiful, terrible dream. The oath had been sworn. The The die cast, and somewhere in the distance, though they could not yet hear it, the sound of marching feet and clashing arms was already beginning to echo across the years. The ships that carried young Hannibal across the strait to Iberia moved like dreams through morning mist, their purple sails catching the first light of dawn as Spain's mountainous coastline emerged from the sea like a sleeping giant gradually awakening. He was no longer the boy who had sworn his oath in Carthage's sacred shrine. At 18, he possessed the lean frame and watchful eyes of a born soldier, though his education had only just begun. Hamilcar had claimed Spain as his own private kingdom, a base from which to rebuild Carthaginian power and perhaps, though this was spoken only in whispers, to launch the revenge that burned in both their hearts. The Spanish peninsula offered everything a general could desire: silver mines to fund armies, fierce tribes to recruit as allies, and mountain passes that could serve as training grounds for the impossible campaigns that danced in Hamilcar's dreams. Picture the morning when Hannibal first saw his father's Spanish army assembled for review. In the pre-dawn darkness, cook fires dotted the plain like fallen stars, and the air filled with the soft sounds of preparation. Leather creaking as armor was adjusted, metal ringing as weapons were sharpened, and the low murmur of conversations in a dozen different languages. These were not the disciplined citizen soldiers of Rome, but something far more dangerous. Professional warriors drawn from every corner of the known world, united by loyalty to a single man and the promise of glory and gold. There were Numidians from the desert, their horses so perfectly trained that rider and mount seemed to share a single mind. In the morning light, they would perform feats of horsemanship that seemed to defy the natural world, shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, wheeling and turning their mounts with barely perceptible shifts of weight and balance. Young Hannibal would spend hours watching them, memorizing their techniques and gradually winning their respect through his willingness to learn their ways. The Iberians themselves were a revelation. These were not barbarians, as Roman propaganda claimed, but people with their own ancient traditions of metalworking, their own codes of honor, and their own fierce pride in their independence. Their falcator swords, curved like a lion's claw, could cut through Roman mail as if it were silk. Their knowledge of the Spanish terrain was encyclopedic. Every mountain path, every hidden valley, every stream that could be forded or river that must be bridged. But perhaps most impressive were the Gallic warriors, tall men with golden hair and eyes like winter sky, who fought with a berserker fury that could break the discipline of even veteran legions. They were poets as well as fighters, and in the evenings around the campfires, their singing voices would weave tales of ancient heroes and impossible quests that made even hardened mercenaries weep. Hamilcar moved among these diverse forces, like a master musician conducting a complex symphony. He spoke to each group in their own language, honored their customs, and somehow forged them into a single instrument of war. Watching his father work, Hannibal absorbed lessons in leadership that no scroll or tutor could have taught. He learned that true command came not from fear or gold, though both had their place, but from understanding what each man needed to feel valued and purposeful. The education continued through campaign seasons that blurred together in memory. Dusty marches through the Spanish heartland, sieges of hilltop fortresses that seemed to grow from the living rock, and diplomatic negotiations conducted in torchlit halls where a single wrong word could mean the difference between alliance and war. Hannibal learned to read the subtle signs that revealed a man's true intentions, the way eyes shifted when lies were spoken, the unconscious gestures that betrayed fear or overconfidence, the tone of voice that indicated whether a promise would be kept or broken at the first opportunity. Mathematics became not abstract theory, but practical necessity. How many tons of grain would feed 30,000 men for a month's march? How much silver would it take to keep Gallic mercenaries loyal when Roman gold began flowing to their chieftains? What angle of approach would allow siege engines to breach a particular type of wall construction? These calculations, worked out by lamplight in campaign tents while winter winds howled outside, would serve him well when he faced challenges that no textbook had ever contemplated. Languages came easily to his quick mind. Soon he could haggle with merchants in their own dialects, joke with soldiers in the crude argot of the barracks, and conduct delicate negotiations with tribal elders in the flowery phrases that indicated proper respect. This gift for communication would prove invaluable when his own army became a Tower of Babel, with contingents from Africa, Spain, and Gaul who shared little besides their faith in their general's genius. But the most important lessons were taught not through words but through observation and experience. Hannibal learned to sleep lightly, waking instantly at any unusual sound. He learned to eat whatever food was available without complaint, to endure heat and cold with equal stoicism, and to inspire confidence in others even when privately wrestling with doubt. He learned the delicate balance between showing mercy to defeated enemies and demonstrating the consequences of resistance. Most crucially, he learned patience. While Roman generals were expected to achieve rapid victories to advance their political careers, Carthaginian command was a lifetime appointment. Hamilcar taught his son to think in terms of decades rather than seasons, to build networks of loyalty that would endure through temporary setbacks, and to view each campaign as a single note in a much longer composition. The transformation from student to practitioner occurred gradually, then suddenly. During a mountain campaign against the Oritani, Hamilcar fell gravely ill with fever. For 3 days, while the army waited in worried silence, the fate of the expedition hung in the balance. When the general finally emerged from his tent, pale but determined, he made an announcement that surprised no one who had been watching closely. Hannibal would command the cavalry in the next engagement. That first independent command was a small affair, a reconnaissance in force against a Spanish hill fort that could have been bypassed entirely. But for young Hannibal, leading 2,000 horsemen up a rocky slope while arrows whistled overhead, it might have been the siege of Troy itself. The tactical challenge was modest: draw the defenders out of their fortifications and pin them in place while the main force stormed the walls. But the psychological weight was enormous. The knowledge that hundreds of men were trusting their lives to his judgment, that his father's reputation rode with his success or failure. The attack succeeded, though not without cost. 12 good men died that day, their names later inscribed on a bronze tablet that Hannibal would carry for the rest of his life. That night, as he walked among the wounded and spoke words of comfort to men who might never see their homes again, he understood at last what his father had been trying to teach him. Command was not about glory or personal achievement. It was about the sacred responsibility to preserve and honor the trust that others placed in your hands. When Hamilcar's own end came drowned during a winter crossing of the Jukar River while pursuing retreating enemies, Hannibal was ready to assume the burden he had been preparing to carry since childhood. The army that acclaimed him as their new commander was no longer foreign to him. These men were his brothers, his responsibility, and his instrument for fulfilling the oath that still burned in his heart like an unquenched flame. The student had become the master, but the education would continue for the rest of his life, paid for in blood and measured in the rise and fall of empires. The morning mist rose from the Tagus River like the breath of sleeping gods as 26-year-old Hannibal Barca stood before the assembled army of New Carthage. The purple cloak of command, still bearing the salt stains from his father's final campaign, rested heavily on his shoulders, heavier than its silk and gold threads could account for. In the pre-dawn silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the harbour walls and the distant cry of seabirds, history paused to witness the passing of authority from one generation to the next. The ceremony was simple, as befitted a people who preferred substance to show. The weathered veterans who had served under Hamilcar stepped forward one by one, their scarred hands touching the hilt of Hannibal's sword in the ancient gesture of allegiance. These were men who had followed his father through 20 years of campaigns, who had seen him build an empire in Spain from nothing but will and tactical genius. Their acceptance of the son was not automatic. It had to be earned through demonstrated competence and the harder currency of shared hardship. Old Hannibal, the Numidian cavalry commander whose desert-trained eyes could read the intentions of an enemy army like a priest reading omens in sacrificial entrails, was among the first to pledge his loyalty. Behind him came Mago, Hannibal's younger brother, whose easy smile masked a military mind nearly as sharp as his siblings. The Spanish chieftains followed, their colourful robes and golden torques glinting in the strengthening light as they offered submission to the new general who had grown to manhood among their people. But it was the common soldiers whose acceptance mattered most. These were the men who would march where he led them, who would die at his command, and whose loyalty could never be purchased with gold or compelled by fear alone. As the sun climbed higher, Hannibal walked among their ranks, greeting veterans by name, inquiring about their families, and demonstrating the kind of personal attention that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. The challenges facing the new commander were as numerous as the autumn leaves that drifted down from the Spanish hills. Rome's power was growing like a cancer across the Mediterranean, her influence spreading through diplomatic pressure, economic leverage, and the ever-present threat of military intervention. The treaty that had ended the First Punic War included clauses specifically designed to limit Carthaginian expansion in Spain, and Roman advisors were already making contact with Spanish tribes who might be turned against their Carthaginian overlords. Yet Hannibal also inherited advantages that his father had spent decades accumulating. The silver mines of southern Spain produced wealth that could fund military operations for years. The strategic port of New Carthage, with its magnificent harbour and impregnable fortifications, provided a base that could withstand any conceivable siege. Most importantly, he commanded the loyalty of soldiers who had learned to trust Barca leadership and who shared his family's hatred of Rome. The transition from follower to leader required psychological adjustments that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. Where once he had been responsible only for his own actions, and perhaps those of a small cavalry detachment, now every decision rippled outward to affect thousands of lives. A casual comment about supplies could send quartermasters scrambling across the countryside. A moment's hesitation during a council of war could be interpreted as uncertainty by subordinates who needed to believe in their commander's infallibility. Hannibal's first test came sooner than expected. The Alcaides, a Spanish tribe that had submitted to his father only reluctantly, chose the moment of transition to rebel against Carthaginian authority. Their hilltop capital of Althea bristled with newly constructed fortifications, and intelligence reports suggested that Roman gold had found its way into their treasure houses. The message was clear: the untested young general would be challenged immediately, and his response would set the tone for his entire reign. The campaign against the Alcaides became a masterclass in applied psychology as much as military tactics. Rather than simply besieging Althea and starving it into submission, the cautious approach that most generals would have chosen, Hannibal decided to demonstrate the futility of resistance through overwhelming force and terrifying efficiency. His combined arms assault combined the mobility of Numidian cavalry, the precision of Balearic slingers, and the steady courage of African infantry in a symphony of destruction that reduced the rebel stronghold to rubble in a single day. But it was Hannibal's treatment of the defeated Alcaides that truly announced the arrival of a new kind of leadership. Rather than enslaving the survivors or executing their leaders, the standard Roman response to rebellion, he incorporated their warriors into his own forces and confirmed their chieftains in positions of honor. The message traveled faster than his cavalry: submit to Hannibal and prosper, resist him and face annihilation, but never doubt that he possessed both the strength to destroy and the wisdom to forgive. The psychological impact of this first victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Spanish tribes that had been wavering between Carthaginian and Roman influence suddenly found the choice much clearer. Roman promises of eventual reward seemed pale compared to Hannibal's immediate demonstrations of both strength and magnanimity. By winter's end, his army had grown by more than 10,000 men, and his reputation had spread from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar. Yet even as he savoured these early successes, Hannibal never lost sight of the larger strategy that his father had bequeathed to him. Spain was not an end in itself, but a means, a base for building the army that would one day carry out the oath sworn by a 9-year-old boy in a Carthaginian shrine. Every silver coin extracted from Spanish mines, every warrior recruited from Spanish tribes, and every lesson learned in Spanish campaigns was another piece in the vast puzzle that would culminate in the destruction of Rome. As winter settled over the Spanish highlands and snow began to dust the peaks of the distant Pyrenees, Hannibal would stand on the walls of New Carthage in the evening hours, watching the sun set over waters that stretched northward toward Gaul, toward the Alps, and toward the destiny that called to him like the voice of his ancestors. The boy had become a man, the student had become a teacher, and the son had assumed his father's burden. But the greatest test still lay ahead, beyond mountains that no army had ever crossed, in the heart of an empire that had never known defeat on its own soil. The inheritance was complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. In the soft light of early morning, when dew still clung to the olive trees and the Mediterranean stretched away like hammered silver, the city of Saguntum, perched on its rocky hill, seemed to float between earth and sky. This ancient settlement, with its weathered walls and narrow streets climbing toward a temple-crowned acropolis, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. But in the year 219 BCE, as Hannibal's army spread across the plain below like a dark tide, Saguntum was destined to become something more than just another conquered city. It would become the spark that ignited the greatest war the ancient world had ever seen. The choice of Saguntum as his target was not made lightly. Hannibal understood, with the cold calculation that marked all his strategic thinking, that Rome would not tolerate a direct assault on one of her allies. The city lay south of the Ebro River, well within the sphere of influence that the treaty ending the First Punic War had granted to Carthage. But legal technicalities mattered little when measured against the broader currents of power and ambition that were drawing the two great civilizations toward inevitable collision. Picture the methodical patience with which Hannibal conducted the siege. This was not the frenzied assault of a barbarian warlord, but the carefully orchestrated pressure of an engineer solving a complex problem. His Spanish auxiliaries, their bronze-headed spears glinting in the autumn sunlight, established a loose perimeter that gradually tightened like a noose. Numidian cavalry, their desert-bred horses moving like shadows across the surrounding countryside, cut off all communication between the besieged city and the outside world. The siege engines that rose from the Carthaginian camps were marvels of military engineering, products of knowledge accumulated across centuries of Mediterranean warfare. Massive catapults, their twisted sinew springs capable of hurling stones the size of millstones, were positioned with mathematical precision to maximize their psychological as well as physical impact. The steady rhythm of their operation, the creaking of windlasses, the sharp crack of release, the crash of stone against stone, became the metronome that marked the passing days. But it was in the construction of his approach trenches that Hannibal's genius truly shone. Rather than the straight lines favoured by Roman engineers, his zigzag parallels followed the natural contours of the terrain, offering maximum protection to his advancing troops while presenting minimal target area to the defenders' artillery. Each night, under cover of darkness, the trenches crept closer to Saguntum's walls like patient serpents, their progress marked by the soft scrape of shovels and the whispered orders of section leaders. The defenders of Saguntum fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that surrender meant slavery or death. From the walls, their slingers sent volleys of lead bullets whistling down into the Carthaginian trenches, each projectile inscribed with curses against the besiegers in archaic Greek. Their archers, many of them veterans of previous conflicts, could drive arrows through a bronze shield at 200 paces. When Carthaginian assault troops managed to reach the base of the walls, they met showers of boiling oil and carefully aimed stones that crushed armor and bone with equal efficiency. Hannibal himself was no distant commander directing the siege from comfortable headquarters. Each morning, before the sun climbed high enough to make movement dangerous, he could be seen moving through the forward trenches like a ghost in his earth-stained cloak, conferring with engineers about the placement of undermining shafts, encouraging assault troops with quiet words of praise, and studying the walls with the focused intensity of a master craftsman examining a particularly challenging piece of work. It was during one of these forward reconnaissance missions that Hannibal received the wound that nearly ended his career before it had properly begun. A Spanish javelin, thrown with desperate accuracy by a defender who had recognized the Carthaginian general, caught him in the thigh and lodged against the bone. For 3 days, while infection raged through his body and fever painted strange visions behind his closed eyelids, the siege ground to a halt as his subordinates waited to see whether their commander would live or die. The delirium of those fever nights revealed something of the depths of Hannibal's commitment to his cause. Witnesses reported that he spoke constantly of his father, of the oath sworn in childhood, and of elephants crossing snow-covered mountains toward a city of 7 hills. When consciousness finally returned, his first question was not about his own condition, but about the progress of the siege works and the morale of his troops. Recovery was slow and painful, but it also provided Hannibal with an opportunity to observe the siege from a different perspective. Confined to his tent for several weeks, he spent his time in detailed planning for future campaigns, sketching routes through mountain passes that existed only in the reports of traders and the songs of Celtic bards, and calculating the logistics of moving an army through terrain where no army had ever marched. The enforced inactivity also allowed him to study his own officers more closely, identifying those whose loyalty could be trusted absolutely and those who might need to be watched more carefully. By the time Hannibal was strong enough to resume active command, winter was approaching and the siege had settled into the patient rhythm that characterized ancient warfare. This was not the frantic pace of modern conflict, but something more like the slow movement of geological forces, inexorable, predictable, and ultimately irresistible. The defenders of Saguntum, their food supplies dwindling, and their hope of relief fading with each passing day, began to show signs of the psychological strain that inevitably affected besieged populations. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. A section of the ancient wall, weakened by months of bombardment and undermining, collapsed during a winter storm with a sound like thunder rolling across the hills. Carthaginian assault troops poured through the breach like a dark flood, their battle cries echoing from the stone buildings as they fought their way up the narrow streets toward the citadel where the last defenders had taken refuge. But even in victory, Hannibal demonstrated the calculated mercy that would become his trademark. Rather than allowing his troops the customary sack that followed a successful siege, he ordered that civilians be spared, and that the city's wealth be carefully inventoried for the Carthaginian treasury. The message was clear. Hannibal made war on Rome's allies, not on innocents who had been caught between greater powers. As news of Saguntum's fall spread across the Mediterranean world, carried by merchant ships and diplomatic couriers, the reaction was everything Hannibal had anticipated. In Rome, senators who had been arguing about tax policies and provincial assignments suddenly found themselves debating declarations of war. The die had been cast, the challenge issued, and the greatest conflict of the ancient world had begun with the fall of stones from an ancient wall and the sound of Carthaginian trumpets echoing across a Spanish plain. The morning that would change the course of human history dawned clear and bright over New Carthage, with the Mediterranean sparkling like scattered diamonds beneath a cloudless sky. In the great harbour, where Hamilcar had once taught his son to read the subtle signs that revealed wind direction and weather patterns, an extraordinary procession was taking shape. This was not merely an army preparing to march, it was an entire civilization placing its faith in the impossible dream of one man's genius. Picture, if you will, the extraordinary nature of this assembly. 90,000 infantry stood in perfect formation on the plain outside the city walls, their weapons and armour glinting in the strengthening sunlight like a vast field of deadly flowers. These were not the uniform legions of Rome, but something far more complex and beautiful, a living tapestry woven from the finest military traditions of a dozen different peoples. Spanish scutari, with their distinctive oval shields, painted in clan colours, African spearmen, whose bronze-tipped weapons had been forged in the workshops of Carthage itself, and Gallic warriors, whose golden torques and elaborately decorated swords spoke of a culture that viewed war as the highest form of art. The cavalry was equally diverse and magnificent. 12,000 horsemen sat their mounts with the easy grace of men born to the saddle, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool morning air as if they too understood the magnitude of the journey ahead. Numidian light cavalry, riding bareback with only a rope halter for control, could perform feats of horsemanship that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Spanish heavy cavalry, armoured in bronze and iron, were equally at home in the chaos of battle or the delicate manoeuvring required for reconnaissance and screening. Celtic horsemen from distant Gaul sat their shaggy ponies like centaurs, their long spears held upright like a forest of iron trees. But it was the elephants that truly captured the imagination and struck awe into the hearts of all who witnessed this unprecedented spectacle. 37 of these magnificent beasts, each standing twice the height of a tall man, swayed gently in their traces as their mahouts made final preparations for the journey ahead. These were not the massive African bush elephants that modern zoo visitors know, but the smaller, more manageable forest elephants that Carthaginian trainers had been working with for generations. Each animal carried a wooden tower on its back, equipped with javelins, arrows, and a crew of warriors who could rain death down on enemy formations like the wrath of angry gods. The logistical complexity of moving such a force defied easy comprehension. Thousands of pack animals, mules, oxen, and hardy Spanish ponies carried supplies that had been calculated and recalculated by Hannibal's quartermasters with obsessive precision. Each elephant required 300 pounds of fodder per day, each horse needed 20 pounds of grain, and each human being consumed a minimum of 3 pounds of bread, meat, and other essentials. The mathematical progression was staggering, over 100,000 living creatures, all dependent on the organizational genius of their commanders for their daily survival. Hannibal himself moved through this controlled chaos like a master conductor preparing for the performance of his life. Dressed in the simple armour of a common soldier, a deliberate choice that spoke of his identification with the men he led, he paused to speak with officers, to check on the welfare of individual animals, and to review the endless lists and calculations that would mean the difference between success and catastrophe. His staff officers, seasoned veterans who had learned to anticipate their commander's needs, shadowed his movements with the careful attention to detail that would characterize every aspect of the coming campaign. The route they would follow had been planned for months, traced and retraced on maps that represented the accumulated geographical knowledge of centuries. From New Carthage, they would march north along the Spanish coast, through territories that Hamilcar and his son had spent years preparing with careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. The Pyrenees, that great wall of stone and snow that separated Spain from Gaul, loomed ahead like a promise and a threat. Beyond lay the mysterious lands of the Celts, tribal peoples whose warriors were renowned for their courage, but whose loyalty could never be taken for granted. But it was the Alps themselves, those legendary peaks that formed the spine of the known world, that represented the ultimate test of Hannibal's strategic vision. No army in recorded history had ever crossed those mountains with the intention of making war on the far side. The very idea seemed to violate natural law, to represent the kind of hubris that inevitably brought divine punishment. Roman strategists, secure in their assumption that their homeland was protected by barriers of geography as much as military might, had made no significant preparations for an invasion from the north. The psychological dimension of the enterprise was as important as its physical challenges. Hannibal understood that he was asking his men to follow him into legend, to participate in an adventure that would be remembered and retold for as long as humans gathered around fires to share stories of courage and impossible achievement. But he also knew that legends were built on the accumulated weight of small decisions, daily acts of discipline, and mutual support that transformed a collection of individuals into something greater than the sum of its parts. The morning of departure was marked by ceremonies that blended the military traditions of many peoples into something new and unique. Carthaginian priests offered sacrifices to Tanit and Baal Hamon, asking for divine protection for the great enterprise. Spanish chieftains renewed their oaths of loyalty in the flowery language of their people, while Gallic warriors sang war songs that made the very air vibrate with their intensity. Numidian cavalry performed ritual demonstrations of their skills, their horses dancing through complex patterns while arrows flew with supernatural accuracy toward distant targets. As the sun reached its zenith, Hannibal mounted his personal warhorse, a magnificent Spanish stallion named Surus, whose intelligence and courage would become legendary in their own right, and rode to the head of the great column. Behind him stretched a river of men and beasts that extended beyond the horizon, a sight that might have inspired the poets of a more peaceful age to compose epics about the migration of gods and heroes. The first steps of the march were taken in profound silence, broken only by the creak of leather, the jingle of harness, and the soft impact of thousands of feet against the dusty ground. This was history in the making, the moment when dream transformed into reality and the impossible became merely difficult. Each man in that vast procession carried with him the knowledge that he was participating in something unprecedented, that his individual fate was now bound to a collective destiny that no one could fully predict or control. As the column began to move away from New Carthage, families and friends gathered on the city walls to watch their departure. Wives held up children who would not see their fathers for months or years, if ever again. Old men who had served in previous campaigns offered silent prayers to gods who might already have decided the outcome of this great gamble. The sound of weeping mixed with the sound of cheering, creating a complex harmony that spoke of the human cost of all great enterprises. By evening, when the army finally came to rest after its first day's march, they had travelled only 15 miles. But those 15 miles had carried them across an invisible boundary, from the familiar world of Spanish Carthage into the realm of uncertainty where only Hannibal's vision and their own courage could light the way forward. Campfires dotted the countryside like fallen stars, and around each fire men from different nations and cultures shared their evening meal and wondered what strange lands tomorrow would bring. The impossible march had begun. The first snow began to fall as Hannibal's army entered the foothills of the Alps, each flake drifting down like a small, cold prophecy of the ordeal that awaited them in the high passes. What had begun as the greatest military adventure in human history was slowly transforming into something else entirely, a test of endurance that would strip away everything except the essential core of human will and the bonds of loyalty that held fighting men together when civilization itself seemed to be crumbling around them. Picture the magnificent column as it had appeared just weeks before, emerging from the Spanish plains like a river of bronze and steel. Now, As autumn deepened into the cruel promise of Alpine winter, that same force had taken on the appearance of refugees fleeing some great catastrophe. The bright banners that had fluttered so proudly in Mediterranean sunshine hung limp and sodden in the thin air. The war cries that had echoed from valley to valley as they crossed Gaul had given way to the laboured breathing of men and animals struggling to draw sufficient oxygen from air that seemed to offer less sustenance with each step upward. The elephants, those magnificent symbols of Carthaginian power that had terrorized enemies and inspired allies across 3 continents, now seemed pathetically out of place in this landscape of stone and ice. Their great feet, perfectly adapted for the soft ground of African plains or Spanish valleys, slipped and stumbled on surfaces slick with frost and treacherous with hidden crevasses. The mahouts, who had trained for years to work with these intelligent giants, found themselves reduced to simply trying to keep their charges alive from one hour to the next, watching helplessly as creatures that had never known cold in their ancestral memory began to succumb to hypothermia and altitude sickness. Hannibal himself had changed during the ascent, though the transformation was visible only to those who knew him best. The confident young general who had planned this campaign in the warm libraries of New Carthage now moved through his army like a man carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Every decision which path to take when the trail divided, whether to rest the exhausted men or push forward while weather permitted, how to distribute the dwindling supplies, carried consequences that rippled through thousands of lives. The route they followed existed more in the accumulated memory of generations of traders and tribal migrations than in any coherent geographical knowledge. Celtic guides, their weathered faces speaking of lifetimes spent in these mountains, led the way with the cautious steps of men who understood that the Alps killed more through carelessness than malice. They spoke in hushed tones of passages that might be blocked by early snowfall, of tribes that might demand tribute for safe passage, and of valleys where winter winds could freeze a man's breath in his lungs before he could exhale. Food, that most basic requirement of human existence, became an obsession that coloured every conversation and influenced every decision. The carefully calculated supplies that had seemed adequate for the journey now revealed themselves as pathetically insufficient for the extended ordeal that the mountain crossing had become. Foraging, which had supplemented their provisions during the march through Gaul, was virtually impossible in this barren landscape of stone and snow. The pack animals that had carried grain and preserved meat were themselves becoming sources of food, their sacrifice extending the army's survival by days or weeks, while simultaneously reducing their capacity to carry the remaining supplies. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, not because of enemy action, but because of the simple reality that lying still in temperatures well below freezing meant death within hours. Men learned to sleep in shifts, huddled together for warmth while taking turns to maintain the fires that represented the thin line between life and extinction. The mountain wind, howling through passes with a sound like the voices of all the dead who had perished in these heights, made even brief rest a challenge that required constant vigilance. The psychological toll was perhaps more devastating than the physical hardships. These were professional soldiers, men who had chosen warfare as their career and who had faced death in dozens of battles without flinching. But the enemy they faced in the Alps was not something they could fight with sword and spear. The cold was patient, inexorable, and utterly indifferent to human courage or tactical brilliance. It killed without passion, selecting its victims based on nothing more meaningful than a momentary lapse in attention or a small weakness in equipment. Hannibal's genius revealed itself not in any single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small decisions that kept his army moving forward when every instinct screamed for retreat. He walked among his men constantly, appearing wherever morale was lowest or conditions most dangerous. His presence at the head of the column during the most treacherous passages, his willingness to share the same cold rations and frozen water that sustained his soldiers, and his seemingly inexhaustible confidence in ultimate success became the psychological fuel that powered their advance when physical resources were nearly exhausted. The elephants began to die first, their great hearts simply stopping during the coldest nights as their bodies finally surrendered to conditions for which evolution had never prepared them. Each loss was more than tactical. These animals had become symbols of the army's exotic origins and supernatural power, and their deaths felt like omens of approaching disaster. The mahouts, many of whom had worked with the same elephant for years, grieved like parents burying children, their tears freezing on their cheeks before they could fall to the ground. But it was among the human casualties that the true cost of the Alpine crossing revealed itself most clearly. Men who had survived the siege of Saguntum, who had fought their way through hostile Gallic territories, who had overcome every challenge that war and weather could devise, simply lay down one morning and did not rise again. They died not from wounds or disease, but from the accumulated weight of exhaustion, cold, and the kind of despair that settles over the human spirit when hope itself begins to seem like a cruel delusion. The worst moment came at a pass that would later be known to history as the Col de la Traversette, though the Celtic guides had their own name for it, a word that roughly translated as the place where gods test mortals. Here, where the path narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for a single man, a rock slide triggered by the passage of the elephants blocked the route forward and made retreat equally impossible. For 3 days, while supplies dwindled toward nothing and men began to speak openly of surrender or death, Hannibal's engineers worked to clear a passage using techniques that would not be seen again until the age of gunpowder. They built fires against the rock face, heating the stone until it cracked and split, then poured vinegar, their precious supply of wine made sour by the cold, into the fissures to accelerate the fracturing process. The work was done by men whose fingers were so numb from cold that they could barely grip their tools, whose breath came in short gasps as they laboured in air that seemed to contain no sustenance, and whose faith in their commander had been reduced to the single thread of his own unwavering certainty that the passage could be cleared. On the 4th day, when the last of the rock had been moved aside and the path lay open before them, something extraordinary happened. As the army began to move forward once again, a gap in the clouds revealed the valley that lay spread below them like a vision of paradise itself. There, bathed in golden sunlight and stretching away toward the horizon, lay the plains of northern Italy, green, fertile, and warm. The sight struck the surviving soldiers like a physical blow, and many fell to their knees weeping with relief and exhaustion. Hannibal himself stood at the edge of the precipice for a long moment, his gaunt face reflecting emotions too complex for any observer to read completely. Behind him lay the most extraordinary military achievement in human history, the crossing of an impossible barrier that had defeated every previous attempt. Before him lay the prize for which that achievement had been purchased: access to the heartland of Roman power, the opportunity to carry his childhood oath into the very streets where it had been made necessary. But the cost had been terrible. Of the 90,000 men who had begun the journey from New Carthage, fewer than 26,000 remained. The cavalry had been reduced from 12,000 to 6,000, and only a single elephant, the magnificent Surus, had survived the crossing. The survivors were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and dressed in rags, more like vagabonds than the conquerors of the Mediterranean world. Yet as Hannibal looked down at the Italian plains where Roman farmers were bringing in their autumn harvest, completely unaware that history's most dangerous enemy was watching them from the mountain heights, he knew that the sacrifice had been worthwhile. He had achieved the impossible, had brought an army across barriers that existed as much in the human imagination as in physical geography. Rome's northern frontier, which had been considered impregnable for centuries, now lay open before him like an invitation to destiny. The descent from the mountains was almost as treacherous as the ascent had been, but it was undertaken by men who could see their goal and who had already proven to themselves that they could endure whatever the gods might choose to inflict upon them. As they finally set foot on Italian soil, kissing the ground like sailors who had survived an impossible voyage, they carried with them something more valuable than any material treasure: the knowledge that they had participated in a miracle, and that their general was indeed touched by the divine favor that makes legends possible. The impossible had become merely difficult, and the most dangerous phase of Hannibal's war was about to begin. The morning mist that rose from the Po River valley seemed to carry with it whispers of approaching doom, as if the very air itself had become infected with the knowledge that something unprecedented and terrible was descending from the mountain passes. Roman farmers, tending their autumn vineyards and olive groves with the patient rhythms that had sustained Italian agriculture since time immemorial, paused in their work to stare at the northern horizon, where strange clouds seemed to be moving against the wind, and the cry of disturbed birds suggested that the natural order was being disrupted by forces beyond their understanding. Picture the first Italian village to receive confirmed reports of Hannibal's arrival, perhaps Victumulae, a prosperous trading town whose merchants had grown wealthy from the commerce that flowed between Rome and her northern territories. The messenger who brought the news was a Gallic trader, his face pale with exhaustion and his horse lathered with the sweat of desperate haste. His words, spoken in broken Latin mixed with his native tongue, seemed to describe impossibilities: elephants walking through snow, an army of ghosts led by a dead man's son, and the fulfillment of prophecies that Roman priests had dismissed as barbarian superstition. At first, the reports were treated with the skepticism that civilized people reserve for the tales of primitive peoples. Elephants in the Alps. Preposterous. A Carthaginian army in northern Italy. Militarily impossible, given the treaties and geographical barriers that protected Roman territory. But as similar reports began arriving from multiple sources, traders, refugees, and the few Roman patrols that had approached close enough to observe the Carthaginian advance, skepticism gave way to a creeping terror that seemed to seep into the very foundations of Roman confidence. Hannibal understood the psychological dimension of warfare better than any general before or since. His first actions in Italy were calculated not merely to achieve tactical advantage, but to shatter the comfortable assumptions that had allowed Roman citizens to sleep peacefully for generations. Rather than immediately attacking fortified positions or engaging Roman armies, he began a campaign of systematic devastation that was designed to demonstrate the helplessness of Roman authority and the futility of resistance. The destruction was methodical and purposeful, like the work of a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue. Carthaginian cavalry, their horses finally recovered from the Alpine crossing and eager for the rich fodder of Italian pastures, swept across the countryside in coordinated raids that struck simultaneously at targets hundreds of miles apart. Roman villas, their gardens and frescoes representing centuries of accumulated wealth and culture, vanished in columns of smoke that could be seen from the walls of distant cities. The great estates that had made their owners rich and powerful became funeral pyres for a way of life that suddenly seemed as fragile as morning frost. But Hannibal's true genius lay not in destruction, but in construction. The careful building of a coalition that could transform his small army of survivors into the nucleus of a larger force capable of challenging Rome's dominance. The Gallic tribes of northern Italy, many of whom had been conquered by Roman legions within living memory, suddenly found themselves presented with an opportunity for revenge that seemed to have been sent by their gods. Warriors who had been forced to hide their weapons and speak Latin in their own territories now emerged from forests and mountain valleys like a barbarian tide, their war cries echoing across valleys that had known only Roman law for decades. The recruitment process was delicate work that required all of Hannibal's skills as diplomat and psychologist. These Celtic warriors were fierce but unpredictable, capable of extraordinary bravery one day and inexplicable abandonment the next. They fought as individuals rather than as units, and their concepts of military discipline were fundamentally incompatible with the precise coordination that Hannibal's tactical system required. Yet their knowledge of local terrain was encyclopedic. Their hatred of Rome was genuine and profound, and their numbers could compensate for the losses his army had suffered during the mountain crossing. The integration of Gallic warriors into his cosmopolitan force created challenges that had no precedent in military history. Language barriers made communication difficult, while cultural differences led to misunderstandings that sometimes erupted into violence. Spanish veterans, accustomed to the steady discipline of professional soldiers, found themselves serving alongside Celtic berserkers whose battle fury was magnificent but almost impossible to control. Numidian cavalry, raised in the desert traditions of individual excellence and personal honor, struggled to coordinate with Gallic horsemen whose tactics emphasized mass charges and psychological intimidation. Yet somehow, through a combination of personal charisma, tactical genius, and sheer force of will, Hannibal forged these diverse elements into something resembling a coherent military organization. He spoke to each group in their own language, honored their customs and religious beliefs, and demonstrated again and again that his cause was their cause, the destruction of the power that had oppressed them all. Around evening campfires, where the smoke carried the scents of Spanish olive oil, African spices, and Celtic mead, veterans told stories that gradually wove themselves into a common mythology of shared purpose and ultimate triumph. The Roman response to this unprecedented crisis revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their political system. The Senate, accustomed to dealing with external threats through diplomacy backed by the implied threat of military force, found itself confronting an enemy who had already demonstrated that Roman military power was not invincible. Emergency sessions were called, sacred chickens were consulted for omens, and elderly senators who had not thought about military strategy since their youth suddenly found themselves debating the merits of defensive versus offensive tactics. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the man who would later earn the surname Africanus, was dispatched northward with 2 legions and strict instructions to contain the Carthaginian threat before it could spread to the more populated regions of central Italy. His army represented the finest traditions of Roman military excellence. Citizen soldiers who had been trained from boyhood in the disciplines of war, equipped with the best weapons that Roman technology could produce, and organized according to tactical principles that had conquered most of the known world. But as Scipio's legions marched north along the great roads that Roman engineers had carved through mountain and valley, they carried with them more than weapons and supplies. They bore the accumulated weight of Roman expectations, the assumption that their mere appearance on the battlefield would be sufficient to send any barbarian army fleeing in terror toward whatever wilderness had spawned it. The psychological shock of discovering that their enemies were not only unimpressed by Roman military reputation, but actively seeking battle, would prove almost as devastating as the tactical defeats that followed. The first encounters between Roman patrols and Carthaginian scouts were small affairs, skirmishes involving a few dozen men that would normally have merited no more than a footnote in military dispatches. But the reports that filtered back to Roman headquarters told a disturbing story of enemies who fought with unprecedented skill and coordination, who seemed to anticipate Roman tactics before they were implemented, and who displayed a level of tactical sophistication that challenged every assumption about barbarian military capabilities. As winter approached and the campaign season traditionally came to an end, both armies settled into the uncomfortable reality of extended operations in hostile territory. For the Romans, this meant establishing fortified camps according to procedures that had been refined over centuries of warfare, maintaining supply lines that stretched back to the heartland of Italy, and preparing for a spring campaign that would surely result in the annihilation of an enemy force that had dared to violate the sacred boundaries of Roman territory. For Hannibal, winter meant something entirely different, an opportunity to consolidate his gains, integrate his diverse forces into a more effective fighting machine, and prepare for the campaigns that would either fulfill his childhood oath or destroy him in the attempt. As snow began to fall on the Alps where so many of his men had perished, he could look back on the first phase of his Italian adventure with quiet satisfaction. The impossible had been achieved, the Romans had been forced to take him seriously, and the stage was set for battles that would determine the fate of civilizations. Terror had indeed come to Italy, but it wore a human face and spoke in the cultured accents of Carthaginian nobility. The December morning that would write its name in blood across the pages of military history dawned grey and bitter cold, with frost painting the Italian countryside silver and the Trebia river running black as ink between banks heavy with winter ice. In the pre-dawn darkness, while Roman sentries stamped their feet and blew on numb fingers to maintain feeling in their hands, Hannibal was already in motion, his plans set in motion like the gears of some great machine designed to transform Roman confidence into Carthaginian victory. Picture the scene as dawn slowly revealed the dispositions of both armies. Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus had arrayed his forces according to the classical Roman system that had brought victory across 3 continents, 4 legions in the centre, their bronze shields and iron-tipped pillar, glinting in the weak sunlight, flanked by Latin allies whose loyalty to Rome had been purchased with promises of shared conquest and plunder. Behind them stood the velites, light infantry armed with javelins, and burning with the aggressive confidence of young men who had grown up hearing stories of Roman invincibility. The Roman battle line stretched for nearly a mile across the flat ground north of the river, 40,000 men arranged in the geometric precision that Roman drill masters had refined through generations of practice. To Sempronius, surveying his forces from horseback as the morning mist began to lift, it must have seemed like the perfect instrument for crushing an enemy who had dared to challenge Roman authority on Italian soil. His cavalry, though outnumbered, were drawn from the finest families of Rome and her allies, men who had been riding since childhood, and who viewed combat as an opportunity to demonstrate their fitness for political leadership. But Hannibal had spent the dark hours before dawn arranging a very different kind of chess game. His brother Mago, with a carefully selected force of infantry and cavalry, had moved under cover of darkness to concealed positions along the riverbank, where tall grass and winter brush would hide them until the moment came to spring the trap. Numidian horsemen, their desert-bred mounts moving like shadows in the pre-dawn gloom, had crossed the river at carefully reconnoitred fording points and taken position on the Roman flanks, ready to strike when confusion and panic created the opportunities that superior numbers alone could never provide. The battle began, as so many ancient engagements did, with the ritual exchange of missiles that served as both tactical necessity and psychological preparation for the hand-to-hand combat that would follow. Roman velites advanced to skirmishing range, their javelins arcing through the morning air like deadly rain, while Balearic slingers responded with lead bullets that could punch through bronze armor at 200 paces. The sound was like hail on a tile roof, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the crash of shields as formations dressed their lines and prepared for the real work of battle. Hannibal's tactical genius revealed itself not in any single dramatic maneuver, but in the patient coordination of multiple elements that gradually drew the Romans into a position where their superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. His centre, composed of Gallic warriors whose courage was magnificent but whose discipline was questionable, gave ground slowly but steadily under Roman pressure, drawing the legions forward across the icy ground toward what appeared to be inevitable victory. The Roman advance was a thing of terrible beauty, 4 legions moving in perfect coordination across the frozen field like some great machine of war. The measured tramp of hobnailed sandals on hard ground, the rhythmic clash of pilum against shield rim, and the harsh breathing of men engaged in mortal combat created a symphony of organised violence that had been heard from Britain to Egypt. For Sempronius, watching from his command position, it must have seemed like the vindication of everything Romans believed about their superiority over barbarian enemies. But the Carthaginian retreat was as carefully orchestrated as a ballet, with each backward step serving to draw the Romans deeper into the killing ground that Hannibal had prepared. The Gallic warriors, many of whom were fighting their first battle under Carthaginian command, demonstrated the kind of tactical sophistication that Roman propaganda claimed was impossible for barbarian forces. They gave ground when pressed, counterattacked when opportunity presented itself, and maintained their formation even under the crushing pressure of Roman infantry advancing in the classic wedge formation that had broken so many enemy lines. The moment of truth came, when the Roman advance had carried them so far forward that their flanks were exposed and their reserves were committed to supporting the main assault. At a signal that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, the concealed Carthaginian forces rose from their hiding places, like the earth itself was giving birth to armed warriors. Mago's infantry struck the Roman left flank with the fury of men who had been waiting hours in bitter cold for their moment of vengeance, while Numidian cavalry swept around the Roman right like a desert sandstorm, their war cries echoing across the battlefield like the voices of avenging demons. The psychological shock was almost as devastating as the physical assault. Roman soldiers, trained from childhood to believe in their tactical superiority and the inevitable triumph of Roman arms, suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemies who had appeared as if by magic. The careful formations that were the foundation of Roman military effectiveness began to dissolve as individual units found themselves fighting for survival rather than advancing toward victory. Officers who had been shouting orders for advance found themselves screaming contradictory commands for retreat, rally, and defense. But even as their tactical situation collapsed around them, many Romans fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that defeat in battle meant not just death, but the destruction of everything they held sacred. The centre of the Roman line, composed of veteran legionaries who had served in a dozen campaigns, held their ground with magnificent stubbornness even as Carthaginian cavalry swept around their flanks and Gallic warriors pressed against their front. For nearly 2 hours, the battle raged with an intensity that seemed to transform the frozen ground into a vision of hell itself. The Trebia river, which had been running clear and cold when the morning began, gradually turned red with the blood of men and horses as the tide of battle swept back and forth across its banks. Roman soldiers, weighed down by their heavy armour and hampered by the icy water, struggled to maintain their footing, while Carthaginian light infantry, many of them stripped to the waist despite the bitter cold, moved through the current like deadly fish pursuing wounded prey. When the end finally came, it came with the terrible swiftness that marks the collapse of all human institutions when their foundational assumptions are proven false. The Roman army, which had marched north with such confidence just days before, dissolved into a flood of desperate men seeking only to escape with their lives. Of the 40,000 Romans who had entered the battle, fewer than 10,000 would see Rome again, and many of those bore wounds that would mark them for the rest of their lives. As the winter sun set on the battlefield of Trebia, painting the snow-covered ground red and gold, Hannibal could survey his first great victory on Italian soil with quiet satisfaction. The oath sworn by a 9-year-old boy in a Carthaginian shrine was beginning to bear fruit, and the name that had once been whispered in Roman nurseries as a distant threat was now being spoken in the Senate House as an immediate and mortal danger. The impossible had become inevitable, and Rome's long dominion over Italy was beginning to crack like ice in the spring sun. The early morning mist that rose from Lake Trasimene on the 24th day of June in the year 217 BCE seemed to breathe with a life of its own, coiling and shifting through the valleys like the dreams of sleeping gods. This ethereal shroud, born from the marriage of cool night air and warm lake water, would serve as the perfect stage for what military historians would later recognize as the most perfectly executed ambush in recorded history, a tactical masterpiece that would transform Hannibal from merely dangerous enemy into the stuff of Roman nightmares. Picture the lake in those early hours, when darkness still clung to the surrounding hills, and the water lay still as polished bronze, reflecting the last stars of night like scattered diamonds. The Umbrian countryside that surrounded this ancient body of water had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations since before memory began, its rolling hills and fertile valleys providing sanctuary for Etruscan kings, Roman farmers, and now, in the shadows of dawn, an army of Carthaginian ghosts preparing to write history in letters of blood and bronze. Hannibal had chosen his ground with the eye of an artist selecting canvas for a masterpiece. The road from Arezzo to Perusia followed the northern shore of the lake, squeezed between the water's edge and a series of hills that rose like sleeping giants from the morning mist. For an army advancing in column formation, as Roman armies invariably did when moving through apparently friendly territory, it was a natural route that offered good footing and clear sightlines. For an enemy with superior knowledge of the terrain and the patience to wait for perfect conditions, it was the most beautiful trap that geography had ever created. The positioning of Carthaginian forces in the pre-dawn hours required the kind of coordination that only comes from years of campaign experience and absolute trust between commander and subordinates. Spanish infantry, their bronze-tipped spears invisible in the thick undergrowth, occupied positions along the hilltops where they could overlook the entire length of the ambush zone. Gallic warriors, their natural ferocity perfectly suited to the kind of downhill charge that would follow the spring of the trap, waited in the deeper valleys where their war cries would be muffled until the moment of attack. African veterans, the steady backbone of Hannibal's army, were positioned at both ends of the killing ground to prevent escape and ensure that no Roman would survive to carry word of the disaster back to Rome. The approach of Consul Gaius Flaminius and his 2 legions could be felt through the ground long before they became visible through the mist. The measured tramp of 25,000 pairs of sandaled feet created a rhythm that seemed to make the very earth pulse with anticipation, while the jingle of armor and weapons provided a metallic counterpoint that spoke of confidence bordering on arrogance. Roman armies moved with the casual certainty of men who had never known defeat on Italian soil, their formations perfect and their discipline absolute. Flaminius himself rode at the head of his forces, his scarlet cloak and elaborately crested helmet marking him as clearly as a beacon fire in the gradually strengthening light. Behind him, the eagle standards of his legions caught the first rays of dawn, their golden wings seeming to promise victory to men who had been taught from childhood that Roman eagles never retreated and Roman soil never yielded to foreign feet. The very sight of those standards, with their associations of countless victories and the accumulated glory of centuries of conquest, should have been enough to send any barbarian army fleeing in terror. But Hannibal was no ordinary barbarian, and the mist that swirled around Lake Trasimene that morning seemed to carry with it the whispered prayers of Carthaginian gods who had waited 20 years for this moment of reckoning. As the Roman column stretched itself along the lakeshore road like a great bronze serpent seeking the sun, the Carthaginian general felt the savage satisfaction of a hunter who has tracked his prey to the perfect killing ground and now waits only for the moment to release his arrows. The attack, when it came, erupted from the mist with the fury of a summer thunderstorm that has been building pressure all day before, finally breaking in torrents of rain and lightning. Thousands of warriors who had been invisible just moments before suddenly materialized from the white shroud like the materialization of Roman nightmares, their war cries echoing from the hills in a symphony of vengeance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The Gallic battle cry, That ululating howl that had terrified Roman soldiers since the sack of Rome itself, mixed with the deeper war songs of Spanish veterans and the high, piercing calls of Numidian cavalry to create a sound that seemed to come from another world entirely. The Romans, caught in the perfect storm of tactical surprise and psychological shock, responded with the trained reflexes of professional soldiers, even as their formations began to dissolve under the pressure of attacks coming from every direction simultaneously. Veterans who had served in a dozen campaigns tried desperately to form the defensive squares that Roman drill masters had trained them to create instinctively, but the mist that had concealed their enemies now worked against them, making it impossible to distinguish friend from foe until spear points were already seeking the gaps in their armour. Flaminius himself, struggling to maintain command over a battle that had descended into 100 separate fights scattered along miles of lakeshore, found himself surrounded by Gallic warriors whose ancestors had burned Rome when it was little more than a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. His death, when it came, was swift and personal. A Gallic spear thrust that ended not just a life, but a consulship and the hopes of a Roman family that had served the Republic for generations. The slaughter that followed was methodical and complete, carried out by men who understood that this was not merely a battle, but a reckoning for years of accumulated grievances. Romans who tried to surrender found that mercy was a luxury that Hannibal's diverse army could not afford. Too many of these warriors had seen their own lands devastated by Roman legions, their own families sold into slavery by Roman merchants, their own gods insulted by Roman priests. The lake itself became part of the killing ground, as desperate Romans, weighed down by their heavy armour, attempted to escape by swimming and instead found only a different kind of death in the cold waters that had witnessed so many mortal struggles. When the mist finally lifted and the summer sun illuminated the full extent of the catastrophe, even hardened veterans of many campaigns paused in their looting to stare at what they had accomplished. 15,000 Romans lay dead along the lakeshore road, their blood seeping into soil that had never before been watered by such a harvest of organized violence, while the survivors, perhaps 3,000 men, faced a future of slavery or ransom that would carry news of this disaster to every corner of the Roman world. As evening approached and the surface of Lake Trasimene reflected the colors of sunset like a mirror made of blood and gold, Hannibal could look upon his work with the cold satisfaction of an artist who has achieved perfect expression of his vision. The plain of Cannae spread beneath the merciless August sun, like a vast amphitheatre designed by the gods themselves for the staging of history's most perfect tragedy. Here, where the Alpidus River wound through fields of grain that had been trampled flat by the passage of the largest armies the Mediterranean world had ever seen, the accumulated hatred of a lifetime and the tactical genius of a master strategist would combine to create a battle so flawless in its execution that military academies would study its lessons for more than 2,000 years. Picture the Roman deployment on that fateful morning of August 2nd, 216 BCE, when the largest army in Republican history arranged itself for what its commanders confidently expected would be the final destruction of the Carthaginian threat. 86,000 men stood in formation as the dawn light revealed the magnitude of Rome's commitment to ending Hannibal's impossible campaign once and for all. This was not merely an army, but a manifestation of Roman national will, drawn from every corner of Italy and representing the accumulated military wisdom of centuries of conquest. The consuls, Marcus Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, had learned from the disasters at Trebia and Trasimene, or so they believed. No more tactical subtlety, no more attempts to outmaneuver an enemy who had proven himself a master of deception and surprise. This would be a straightforward test of strength. Against strength, Roman discipline, and superior numbers, crushing Carthaginian cleverness through the simple application of overwhelming force. The legions were deployed in deeper formations than usual, designed to punch through enemy lines like a massive battering ram that nothing could stop or deflect. 8 legions formed the core of this gigantic war machine, their bronze shields and iron-tipped pillar creating a wall of metal that stretched nearly 2 miles across the dusty plain. Behind them stood the allied cohorts, troops drawn from every people that had submitted to Roman rule, their loyalty purchased with promises of citizenship and their courage tested in 100 smaller conflicts. The cavalry, drawn from the finest families of Rome and her Latin allies, took position on the flanks, their horses stamping and snorting in the growing heat as they waited for the signal to begin the slaughter. But across the field, Hannibal was arranging a very different kind of chess game, one that would require not just courage, but perfect timing, absolute discipline, and the kind of tactical coordination that transforms a collection of individual warriors into a single instrument of destruction. His army, though numbering only 50,000 men, was positioned with the mathematical precision of a master engineer designing a machine where every component must function flawlessly for the whole to achieve its purpose. The centre of Hannibal's line was deliberately composed of his weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, who had been ordered to fight with magnificent courage, but also to give ground slowly when pressed by Roman advance. These men understood that they were being asked to serve as bait in a trap whose full dimensions they could only guess at, and their willingness to accept what might well be a death sentence speaks to the extraordinary loyalty that Hannibal inspired in soldiers who had followed him from the ends of the earth. On the flanks, hidden from Roman observation by the careful positioning of light troops and the shimmering heat that rose from the baked earth, waited the true instruments of Carthaginian victory. African veterans, men who had served through every campaign since the march began in Spain, stood in formation with the patient professionalism of soldiers who had learned to trust their general's vision even when that vision seemed to border on madness. These were the men who had crossed the Alps, who had survived Trebia and Trasimene, and who now prepared to participate in what their commander promised would be the perfect battle. The Carthaginian cavalry, commanded by Hasdrubal, not Hannibal's brother, but another officer of that name, represented perhaps the finest mounted force ever assembled in the ancient world. Numidian light cavalry, their horses bred in the desert and trained to maneuver like flocks of birds, could strike with devastating effect and disappear before their enemies could respond. Spanish heavy cavalry, armoured in bronze and wielding long spears, provided the shock action necessary to break enemy formations. Together, they formed a mobile reserve that could be deployed wherever the tactical situation demanded maximum impact. The battle began with the traditional exchange of missiles and the advance of Roman skirmishers, but these preliminary moves served mainly to position both armies for the main event that everyone knew must follow. As the morning sun climbed higher and the heat began to affect men wearing heavy armour, the Roman army began its inexorable advance across the plain. 86,000 men moving with the mechanical precision that Roman drill masters had perfected through generations of practice. The collision between the Roman centre and Hannibal's deliberately weakened line created a sound that could be heard for miles, the crash of bronze against bronze, the splintering of wooden shields, and the screams of men suddenly finding themselves engaged in the most elemental form of human conflict. The Gallic and Spanish warriors fought with magnificent courage, but they were outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, and Roman training and equipment began to tell as the Carthaginian centre slowly gave ground. For Varro and Paulus, watching from their command positions, the battle seemed to be unfolding exactly as their tactical doctrine predicted. Roman superiority in close combat was asserting itself, and the enemy line was beginning to bend under pressure that would soon become irresistible. Orders were sent to commit the reserves and exploit what appeared to be imminent victory, while messengers prepared to carry news of triumph back to Rome. But Hannibal's trap was more sophisticated than any Roman general had imagined possible. As his centre continued its fighting withdrawal, drawing the Romans deeper into what they believed was a rout, the African veterans on both flanks began to wheel inward like the closing jaws of some vast mechanical device. The movement was executed with a precision that spoke of months of practice and years of accumulated trust between commander and subordinates, each unit moving at exactly the right moment to maintain the tactical cohesion that would determine success or failure. The moment when the Romans realized their true situation was perhaps the most terrible in military history. Soldiers who had been advancing confidently toward what seemed like certain victory suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemies attacking from every direction. The formations that were the foundation of Roman tactical effectiveness began to dissolve as units found themselves cut off from their neighbours and forced to fight for survival rather than conquest. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical assault. These were men who had been raised on stories of Roman invincibility, who had been taught from childhood that Roman eagles never retreated and Roman soil never yielded to foreign conquest. The discovery that they were trapped in a killing ground of their enemy's design challenged everything they believed about themselves, their society, and their destiny. Yet even as their tactical situation collapsed around them, many Romans fought with the desperate magnificence of men who understood that death in battle was preferable to the shame of surviving defeat. Veterans of a dozen campaigns stood back to back with young soldiers experiencing their first battle, sharing their last moments of life in the brotherhood that only extreme danger can create. Officers who had lost their commands continued to fight as common soldiers, their scarlet cloaks marking them as targets, while their example inspired others to similar acts of hopeless courage. The slaughter continued through the blazing heat of an Italian summer afternoon, as Hannibal's perfectly coordinated double envelopment compressed the Roman army into an ever smaller space where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. Men died not just from weapons, but from heat exhaustion and suffocation, as the living were pressed against the dead in a mass of humanity that had lost all resemblance to military organization. Consul Paulus, his horse killed beneath him and his body pierced by a dozen wounds, died as he had lived, with dignity and devotion to duty. His last words, according to survivors, were orders for his remaining men to cut their way out of the trap and carry news of the disaster to Rome. Varro, whether through fortune or superior horsemanship, managed to escape with a small cavalry force that would carry the first fragmentary reports of catastrophe back to the city that had never known such defeat. When the sun finally set on the plain of Cannae, it illuminated a scene that seemed to belong more to mythology than to human history. 50,000 Romans lay dead, their bodies covering the earth like a carpet of bronze and scarlet, while thousands more faced slavery or ransom. The largest army in Roman history had been annihilated with such completeness that Hannibal could look upon his work and know that he had achieved something approaching tactical perfection. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, and the first stars appeared above the battlefield where so many dreams had died, Hannibal stood among the Roman dead and contemplated the strange mathematics of victory and revenge. The oath sworn by a child in Carthage had been paid in full, at least for this day, and the name of Rome had been humbled as it had never been humbled before. Yet even in the moment of perfect triumph, questions lingered like shadows in the gathering darkness. The evening after Cannae painted the battlefield in shades of purple and gold, while scavenging birds descended like dark prophets to claim their portion of history's greatest slaughter. Hannibal walked among the Roman dead in the growing twilight, his scarred features reflecting emotions too complex for any observer to read completely. Here lay 50,000 enemies, their bronze armor dulled with dust and blood, their eagle standards trampled into the earth that had never before drunk so deeply of Roman sacrifice. Yet the man who had orchestrated this perfect destruction found victory tasting strangely bitter in his mouth. Picture the scene as darkness gradually claimed the plain where the largest army in Roman history had been transformed into a monument to tactical genius. Carthaginian soldiers moved through the carnage like ghosts, stripping armor from the dead, collecting weapons that would equip future campaigns, and searching for wounded comrades among the thousands of bodies that carpeted the earth. The sounds of their work, the clink of metal against metal, the soft conversations of men who had survived the impossible, the groans of the wounded crying for water, created a symphony of victory that somehow felt more like a funeral dirge. The magnitude of the achievement was undeniable. Military historians of future generations would study this battle as the closest approach to tactical perfection that human warfare had ever produced. Every element of Hannibal's plan had functioned exactly as designed, from the sacrificial courage of his weakened center to the precise timing of his flanking maneuvers. The double envelopment that crushed Roman resistance had been executed with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, transforming a collection of diverse peoples into a single instrument of destruction. Yet as reports began arriving from across Italy, a troubling pattern began to emerge that cast shadows over even this most brilliant of victories. Roman messengers, riding through the night on roads still slick with the blood of their comrades, carried word of the disaster to every corner of the peninsula. But instead of the collapse that Hannibal had expected, the surrender of client states, the dissolution of Roman alliances, the acknowledgement that Rome's day was done, something entirely different began to unfold. The Roman response to Cannae revealed a quality of character that Hannibal had not fully appreciated, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat that transcended rational calculation and entered the realm of religious conviction. In the Senate House, where white-haired patricians gathered to contemplate the worst military disaster in their city's history, the debate was not about surrender terms, but about how quickly new legions could be raised to continue the war. The same people who had lost their sons and brothers on the plain of Cannae voted without hesitation to strip temples of their gold, to free slaves for military service, and to continue fighting until either Rome or Carthage lay in ruins. Hannibal's strategic situation, for all its tactical brilliance, remained fundamentally unchanged. His army, though victorious, was still a foreign force operating in hostile territory, dependent on local allies whose loyalty could shift with the political winds. The casualties suffered at Cannae, though light compared to Roman losses, could not be easily replaced, while Rome's seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower meant that each victory simply summoned new legions to replace those that had been destroyed. The psychological impact of the battle, though profound, proved to be a double-edged sword. While Italian allies who had been wavering in their loyalty to Rome suddenly began to calculate the advantages of joining the Carthaginian cause, the very completeness of Hannibal's victory also awakened a kind of desperate unity among Romans that peaceful success had never achieved. Patricians and plebeians, who had spent generations arguing about land redistribution and political rights, suddenly found themselves united by the shared recognition that their entire way of life was under threat. The famous conference between Hannibal and his officers in the aftermath of Cannae has been recorded by historians with varying degrees of accuracy, but the essential elements of the debate reveal the cruel mathematics that governed even perfect victories. Hannibal, the brilliant Numidian cavalry commander, supposedly urged his general to march immediately on Rome, arguing that the psychological shock of Cannae had created a window of opportunity that might never open again. "You know how to win battles, Hannibal," the old warrior reportedly said, "but you do not know how to use victory." But Hannibal's response revealed the lonely wisdom of supreme command, the understanding that tactical brilliance must always serve larger strategic purposes. His army, though victorious, was not equipped for siege warfare against the massive fortifications that protected Rome itself. His supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, could not support an extended siege of the largest city in the Mediterranean world. Most crucially, his coalition of Italian allies, though growing, was not yet strong enough to guarantee that he could hold any territory he might conquer. The decision not to march on Rome immediately after Cannae would be debated by historians for centuries, with some arguing that Hannibal's caution cost him his best chance for ultimate victory. But the general himself seemed to understand that his war was not merely about military conquest, but about the much more complex task of transforming political allegiances across an entire peninsula. The psychological victory of Cannae, however complete, could only be meaningful if it led to the kind of sustained political change that would make Roman recovery impossible. As winter approached and both armies settled into the uncomfortable routine of sustained warfare, Hannibal found himself grappling with the peculiar loneliness that afflicts all great commanders. His tactical genius had achieved something approaching perfection, but the strategic challenges he faced remained as daunting as ever. Each day brought new reports of Roman preparations, new legions being raised, new alliances being forged among peoples who had concluded that accommodation with Carthage was more dangerous than resistance. The irony of his situation was almost biblical in its dimensions. The man who had sworn to destroy Rome had demonstrated that Roman armies could be destroyed, but Rome herself seemed to possess a quality of resilience that transcended military defeat. Like a hydra in ancient mythology, each head that was severed seemed to produce two more, and the more successful Hannibal became at the tactical level, the more elusive his strategic objectives appeared to become. As he stood among the Roman dead that evening, watching the stars emerge in the Italian sky that had witnessed so much human ambition and folly, Hannibal perhaps began to understand that victory and defeat were more complex categories than he had imagined as a young man swearing oaths in his father's shrine. The hollow crown of tactical perfection rested heavy on his brow, beautiful and brilliant, and somehow insufficient to the magnitude of the task he had set himself. The years that followed Cannae passed like a slow-burning fever, each season bringing new campaigns that seemed to achieve everything except the ultimate goal that had driven Hannibal across the Alps and through the gates of legend itself. The Italian countryside, once green and peaceful under Roman protection, had become a vast chessboard where two master players moved their pieces in an intricate dance of advance and retreat, siege and counter-siege, alliance and betrayal that gradually consumed the strength of both civilizations like a disease eating away at healthy tissue. Picture the transformation that had overtaken Hannibal's army during these years of constant campaigning. The lean, hard men who had descended from the Alpine passes like avenging angels had been replaced by a different kind of force, still dangerous, still capable of brilliant tactical achievements, but somehow lacking the desperate energy that had powered their earlier victories. Veterans who had fought at Trebia and Trasimene were greying now, their reflexes perhaps a fraction slower, their enthusiasm for yet another siege or forced march tempered by the accumulated weight of years spent far from home. The elephants were gone, victims of climate, disease, and the simple passage of time in an environment for which evolution had never prepared them. Surus, the magnificent beast that had been Hannibal's companion since the crossing of the Pyrenees, had died during the winter following Cannae, his great heart finally stopping on a cold Italian night while his mahout wept like a man losing his oldest friend. With the death of the last elephant went something intangible but precious. A sense of the supernatural, the feeling that this army carried with it the blessing of exotic gods and the power to achieve impossible things. Reinforcements from Carthage had proven disappointing, both in quantity and quality. The merchants and politicians who controlled Carthaginian policy seemed unable to understand that their city's greatest general required more than occasional shipments of gold and grudging approval for his strategic initiatives. The reinforcements that did arrive were often poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and led by officers who lacked the kind of experience that could only be gained through years of campaigning against Roman tactics and discipline. Rome, meanwhile, had learned from its disasters with the painful thoroughness that characterized everything the Romans did well. The new generation of commanders who emerged after Cannae approached warfare against Hannibal with a very different philosophy than their predecessors. Where Flaminius and Varro had sought decisive battle and glorious victory, men like Quintus Fabius Maximus embraced a strategy of patient attrition that denied Hannibal the opportunity to achieve the kind of complete tactical victory that had made him famous. The Romans called Fabius Cunctator, the delayer, and initially the nickname was not intended as a compliment. Roman military tradition emphasized aggressive action, decisive engagement, and the kind of glorious death in battle that earned a man immortality in the songs of his people. Fabius's strategy of following Hannibal's army at a distance, occupying strong positions, and refusing battle except under circumstances that offered overwhelming advantage seemed almost cowardly to men raised on stories of heroic charges and desperate last stands. But the Fabian strategy, as historians would later call it, proved devastatingly effective against an enemy whose greatest strength lay in his ability to win battles rather than campaigns. Hannibal could maneuver his forces with the skill of a master chess player, could inspire his diverse troops to acts of magnificent courage, and could devise tactical combinations that left Roman generals studying his methods for generations to come. What he could not do was force Romans to fight when they chose not to fight, or transform tactical victories into the kind of strategic success that would bring the war to a satisfactory conclusion. The siege of Capua, that wealthy city whose defection to Hannibal had seemed to promise the beginning of Rome's political collapse, became a symbol of the cruel mathematics that governed prolonged warfare. Hannibal's efforts to relieve the city required him to divide his already limited forces, while Roman siege works, constructed with the methodical patience that characterized all Roman engineering projects, gradually strangled Capua's resistance through starvation rather than assault. The fall of the city and the terrible reprisals that followed sent a clear message to other Italian communities that were considering changing sides. Rome's memory was long, and her capacity for punishment was virtually unlimited. The march on Rome itself, Hannibal's desperate attempt to break the siege of Capua by threatening the enemy capital, revealed both the continuing power of his reputation and the limitations of his strategic position. When Carthaginian cavalry appeared before the gates of Rome, panic swept through the city like wildfire. Citizens who had grown accustomed to news of distant battles suddenly found themselves face to face with the reality of war, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that the psychological shock might accomplish what 16 years of campaigning had failed to achieve. But the Romans held their nerve and their walls, and Hannibal's demonstration proved to be exactly that, a demonstration rather than a serious assault. His army lacked the equipment necessary for siege warfare against Rome's massive fortifications. His supply situation made extended operations impossible, and the failure of Italian allies to rise in general revolt left him without the local support that might have made the threat credible. After a few days of marching and countermarching in sight of the city that he had sworn to destroy, Hannibal was forced to withdraw southward, leaving behind only the knowledge that he had come tantalizingly close to the object of a lifetime's obsession. The psychological toll of these years was perhaps more devastating than the physical losses that gradually eroded Carthaginian strength. Officers who had followed Hannibal with absolute faith through impossible hardships began to question whether their sacrifices were achieving anything more than the prolongation of an ultimately hopeless struggle. The diverse coalition that had been forged in the fires of early victories began to show signs of strain, as different groups pursued their own interests rather than subordinating everything to the larger cause. Hannibal himself seemed to age decades during these years, his dark hair showing streaks of silver, his scarred face marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. The young general who had led elephants across the Alps with supreme confidence in his destiny had been replaced by a middle-aged commander who understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that military genius alone was insufficient to overcome the kinds of advantages that geography, population, and political organization could provide to a determined enemy. As the 15th year of his Italian campaign dawned, Hannibal could look back on achievements that would have satisfied any other general in history. He had won battles that military academies would study for centuries, had kept a Roman army in the field through sheer force of personality and tactical brilliance, and had demonstrated that the supposedly invincible legions could be defeated by superior strategy and coordination. Yet the ultimate prize, the destruction of Roman power that he had sworn to achieve, seemed as elusive as ever, slipping away like mist on a mountain morning despite all his efforts to grasp it. The long decline had begun, measured not in dramatic defeats, but in the slow erosion of hope itself. The ships that carried Hannibal away from Italian shores moved through the morning mist like mourners departing from a funeral, their purple sails catching the last glimpse of land that had been both stage and prison for the greatest military adventure in human history. After 16 years of campaigning in enemy territory, the general who had sworn to destroy Rome was finally going home, not in triumph as he had once imagined, but in response to desperate summons from a Carthage that found itself under siege by the very enemy his campaigns had been designed to humble. Picture the extraordinary nature of this departure. The army that boarded those Carthaginian vessels bore little resemblance to the magnificent force that had descended from the Alps like an avalanche of bronze and fury. These were the survivors of impossible hardships, men who had followed their general through every kind of trial that war and weather could devise, and who now faced the bitter knowledge that their sacrifices might ultimately prove meaningless. Veterans whose youth had been spent in Spanish camps and Italian battlefields looked back at the receding coastline with emotions too complex for easy description: relief at escaping what had become an impossible situation, sorrow at leaving behind so many comrades who would never see home again, and uncertainty about what kind of reception awaited them in a Carthage that had changed beyond recognition during their long absence. The Italian allies who had cast their lot with Hannibal faced a much crueler fate. These were men who had broken their oaths to Rome, who had welcomed Carthaginian forces into their cities, and who had provided the local support that had made Hannibal's extended campaign possible. Now, with their protector departing and Roman vengeance approaching like a gathering storm, they could only await the terrible settling of accounts that would follow. Some would seek refuge in desperate last stands, others would attempt flight to distant lands, but most would simply wait with the fatalistic resignation of men who understood that their choices had consequences beyond their ability to control. The transformation of Hannibal himself during the voyage home was visible to anyone who had known him in his prime. The confident young general who had planned the impossible march across the Alps had been replaced by something harder and more complex. A man who had achieved tactical perfection, only to discover that perfection itself could be a kind of failure when measured against larger objectives. The dark eyes that had once burned with the certainty of eventual victory now reflected the accumulated wisdom of 16 years spent learning that genius, courage, and determination were not always sufficient to overcome the advantages that geography, population, and political organization could provide to a patient and determined enemy. Carthage itself had aged during Hannibal's absence, its face marked by the scars of Roman siege works and the deeper wounds of political division. The great harbour that had once bustled with merchant vessels from every corner of the Mediterranean now lay partially blockaded by Roman warships, their bronze rams catching the sunlight like the teeth of patient predators. The warehouses that had once overflowed with the wealth of 3 continents showed gaps in their rooflines where catapult stones had found their mark, while the population moved through the streets with the haunted expressions of people who had learned to live with the constant possibility of destruction. The reunion between the general and his homeland was complicated by the political realities that had emerged during his long absence. Hannibal returned to find himself caught between those who blamed him for failing to achieve decisive victory and those who criticized the government for failing to provide adequate support for his campaigns. The merchants who controlled Carthaginian policy had their own explanations for why the war had dragged on so long, most of which involved decisions made by a general who was too far away to defend himself against their accusations. Yet despite these political tensions, Hannibal's homecoming also represented Carthage's last hope for survival as an independent power. The man who had kept Roman armies busy for 16 years was still, at 53 years old, the most formidable military mind of his generation. His knowledge of Roman tactics, his experience in coordinating diverse forces, and his proven ability to inspire loyalty in desperate circumstances made him the obvious choice to lead Carthage's final attempt to preserve its freedom. The strategic situation that Hannibal found upon his return was almost the mirror image of what he had faced when he first crossed the Alps. Now it was Carthage that was surrounded, isolated, and dependent on a single leader's genius to overcome impossible odds. Roman forces under the younger Scipio, son of the consul who had opposed Hannibal in Spain, had landed in Africa and begun the systematic conquest of Carthaginian territories with the same methodical patience that had characterized Roman operations in Italy. The parallels between teacher and student were unmistakable. Scipio had studied Hannibal's methods with the devoted attention of an apprentice learning from a master, adapting Carthaginian tactics to Roman discipline and organization. The double envelopment that had won Cannae became a Roman technique, employed with devastating effect against Carthaginian allies who found themselves facing their own weapons turned against them. The coordination of infantry and cavalry that had been Hannibal's trademark was now being demonstrated by Roman forces who had learned from 16 years of painful experience. Preparing for what both commanders understood would be their final confrontation required. Hannibal to transform himself once again, this time from the offensive genius who had terrorized Italy into the defensive strategist who must preserve what remained of Carthaginian power. The army he assembled was necessarily different from the diverse international force he had led across the Alps, more dependent on local recruiting, less experienced in the kind of campaign coordination that had made his earlier victories possible, but still dangerous in the hands of a general who had spent a lifetime learning how to extract maximum effectiveness from whatever resources were available. As the two armies maneuvered toward their inevitable meeting, both commanders carried the weight of their respective civilizations' expectations. For Scipio, victory would mean the final vindication of Roman persistence, and the emergence of Rome as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. For Hannibal, the stakes were even higher. Not just personal vindication, but the survival of the city and culture that had shaped his identity and given meaning to his life. The boy who had sworn an oath in his father's shrine was about to discover whether a lifetime of dedication to that promise had prepared him for the ultimate test of his abilities, courage, and devotion to the city he had served with such magnificent tragic loyalty. The dawn of October 19th, 2002 BCE broke clear and still over the plains of Zama, as if nature herself was holding her breath before the confrontation that would determine the fate of the ancient world. Two armies faced each other across that dusty field, one representing the accumulated power and persistence of Rome, the other carrying the hopes and dreams of a Carthaginian civilization that had already begun to sense the approach of its own twilight. Between them stretched perhaps 500 paces of African earth that would soon be consecrated with the blood of men who understood that they were fighting not just for victory, but for the right of their peoples to continue existing as independent forces in the Mediterranean world. Picture Hannibal as he surveyed the Roman dispositions in the strengthening light of morning, his weathered features revealing nothing of the emotions that must have been coursing through his mind. Before him stood an army that was recognizably Roman in its discipline and organization, yet subtly different from the legions he had faced in Italy. These men had been trained by Scipio Africanus, a general who had studied Carthaginian methods with the devoted attention of a master craftsman, learning the secrets of his trade, and who now prepared to demonstrate that the student had finally surpassed his distant teacher. The Roman battle line reflected this synthesis of traditions. The legions were arrayed in their traditional formation, but with gaps deliberately left between the maniples to allow Hannibal's elephants to charge through without disrupting the Roman ranks. The cavalry, positioned on both flanks, included not just Roman and Latin horsemen, but also Numidian allies who had transferred their loyalty from Carthage to Rome. A bitter reminder of how completely the political situation had been reversed since the early days of the war. Scipio himself rode along his lines in the pre-battle ritual that all great commanders performed, offering words of encouragement to officers and men who would soon test their courage against the most dangerous enemy their generation had known. Yet there was nothing desperate or uncertain in his manner. This was a general who had already proven himself in Spain, who had earned the cognomen Africanus through victories that had demonstrated his tactical brilliance, and who now approached the culmination of his career with the quiet confidence of a man who understood exactly what needed to be done. For Hannibal, the challenge was more complex and more personal. The army he commanded was a pale reflection of the magnificent force that had crossed the Alps 20 years earlier. His elephants, though numerous, were poorly trained and potentially unreliable. His infantry was composed largely of raw recruits and mercenaries whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned through shared hardship. Only his cavalry retained something of the old excellence, and even they lacked the perfect coordination that had made his earlier victories possible. But perhaps most challenging of all was the psychological dimension of facing an enemy who had learned from his own methods. Scipio's tactical deployment revealed a thorough understanding of Carthaginian principles, the use of flexible formations, the coordination of different types of troops, and the patience to allow the enemy to make the first move while maintaining perfect readiness to exploit any mistake. It was like facing a distorted mirror image of himself, similar enough to be recognizable, but different enough to be genuinely dangerous. The battle began with the charge of Hannibal's elephants, those great beasts that had once struck terror into Roman hearts, but now seemed almost pathetic as they lumbered across the plain toward an enemy who had learned how to neutralize their psychological impact. The Romans' preparation showed itself immediately. Instead of panicking at the sight of charging war elephants, the legions opened their ranks with practiced precision, allowing the animals to pass through harmlessly while subjecting them to a devastating crossfire of javelins and arrows. Many of the elephants, wounded and maddened by pain, turned back toward their own lines, creating exactly the kind of chaos that Scipio had hoped for. Hannibal's carefully planned formation began to dissolve before the main battle had even been joined, as Carthaginian troops found themselves dodging their own war animals while trying to maintain the discipline necessary for effective combat. The infantry engagement that followed revealed the full extent to which Roman tactical doctrine had evolved during the long years of the Hannibalic War. Scipio's legions advanced with the measured precision that was their trademark, but they fought with a flexibility and tactical sophistication that reflected everything they had learned from their defeats at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. When Hannibal's centre began to give ground, whether through genuine pressure or tactical design, the Romans maintained their formation and refused to be drawn into the kind of pursuit that had doomed so many of their predecessors. The decisive moment came when Scipio's cavalry, having dealt with their Carthaginian counterparts, returned to the battlefield and struck Hannibal's army from behind. This was the double envelopment that Hannibal had perfected at Cannae, now being executed against him by an enemy who had studied his methods and adapted them to Roman strengths. The irony was almost too perfect. the master tactician destroyed by his own techniques, wielded with a precision that equaled or exceeded his own. As his army began to collapse around him, Hannibal found himself in the position that so many Roman generals had occupied during his years of victory. His tactical genius, which had seemed almost supernatural in its effectiveness, proved insufficient against an enemy who combined superior numbers with equally superior generalship. The diverse coalition that had been his strength in Italy became a weakness in Africa, as different contingents broke at different moments and fled in different directions, making coordinated resistance impossible. The slaughter that followed was methodical rather than passionate, carried out by Roman soldiers who had learned discipline from their defeats, and who now applied that discipline to the business of victory. 20,000 Carthaginians died on the field of Zama, while perhaps 1,500 Romans fell casualty figures that spoke to the complete reversal of the tactical situation that had prevailed during the early years of the war. Hannibal himself escaped from the battlefield, though whether through good fortune or the deliberate mercy of an enemy who recognized his greatness is unclear. The sight of the most feared general of the ancient world fleeing from his final battle must have been deeply satisfying to Roman observers who remembered the terror his name had once inspired. Yet there was also something almost tragic in the spectacle of genius brought low, of a man whose talents had been equal to impossible tasks, finally encountering a challenge that exceeded even his extraordinary capabilities. As the sun set on the field of Zama, it illuminated the end of an era. Carthaginian independence, which had survived the First Punic War and the terrible years of Hannibal's campaign, was finally extinguished. The terms that Scipio would dictate reflected not just military victory, but the complete transformation of the Mediterranean political system. Carthage would survive as a city, but never again as a power that could challenge Roman hegemony. For Hannibal, riding away from the battlefield where his life's work had finally been undone, the future held only exile and the bitter knowledge that his childhood oath had led him to achieve everything except the one thing that mattered most. The teacher had become student, the hunter had become prey, and the man who had sworn to destroy Rome had instead provided Rome with the trials that forged her into an empire. The eastern Mediterranean kingdoms that provided refuge for history's most dangerous exile soon discovered that harboring Hannibal Barca was like sheltering a magnificent but deadly serpent, beautiful to behold, potentially useful as an ally, but carrying within himself the seeds of destruction for anyone foolish enough to trust completely in his friendship. The man who had once led elephants across impossible mountains now moved through the courts of petty monarchs like a ghost haunted by the memory of greater days, his reputation preceding him like the shadow of storm clouds across a peaceful landscape. Picture the aging general as he appeared to the courtiers of Antiochus III of Syria, or Prusias of Bithynia, or the other minor potentates who briefly imagined that Hannibal's genius might serve their own ambitions against Rome. The dark hair was now streaked with silver, the scarred face marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions, the powerful frame somewhat diminished by years of constant campaigning and the accumulated weight of disappointed hopes. Yet the eyes remained as keen as ever, still capable of reading the subtle signs that revealed a man's true intentions, still burning with the cold fire of intelligence that had made him the most feared enemy in Roman history. The kingdoms of the Hellenistic East were perfect refuges for a man of Hannibal's talents and temperament. Sophisticated enough to appreciate his intellectual gifts, wealthy enough to support him in comfortable exile, yet small enough to dream that his presence might somehow elevate them to great power status. These were the successor states of Alexander's empire, ruled by kings who spoke Greek and lived in palaces filled with magnificent art, but who lacked the unity and vision that had once made their ancestor the master of the known world. Antiochus III, who styled himself the Great, with the casual arrogance that marked all the Seleucid monarchs, was particularly susceptible to the fantasy that Hannibal's presence might transform him into a new Alexander. The Carthaginian exile was welcomed with honours appropriate to his reputation, given a palace suitable to his dignity, and consulted on matters of strategy as if his mere presence could guarantee victory against any enemy. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the man who had humbled Rome might find a new stage worthy of his talents. But the reality of Hellenistic politics proved as frustrating as the reality of Carthaginian politics had been. These kings were essentially provincial monarchs, their horizons limited by regional concerns, and their courage insufficient for the kind of grand strategies that Hannibal's mind naturally conceived. When Antiochus finally went to war against Rome, his campaigns revealed the same fundamental weaknesses that had doomed Carthage: insufficient coordination, inadequate resources, and a failure to understand that defeating Rome required not just winning battles, but transforming the entire political structure of the Mediterranean world. The Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE became a bitter echo of Zama, with Roman legions once again demonstrating their superiority over armies that attempted to employ Carthaginian methods without fully understanding the principles that made those methods effective. Hannibal, commanding a wing of Antiochus's army, found himself once again facing Roman tactical discipline that had been refined through decades of experience against his own innovations. The defeat was comprehensive and decisive, ending Seleucid dreams of challenging Roman hegemony and leaving Hannibal to seek refuge elsewhere. The pattern repeated itself with monotonous regularity as the years passed. King after king welcomed the famous exile, consulted him on military matters, and eventually discovered that his presence attracted Roman attention like honey attracts flies. The web of Roman diplomacy, backed by the ever-present threat of military intervention, gradually enclosed every potential refuge, making it clear that harbouring Hannibal Barca was a luxury that no sensible monarch could afford. During these years of wandering, Hannibal's true character revealed itself in ways that military campaigns had never allowed. Stripped of the authority that came from commanding armies, reduced to the role of advisor and supplicant, he demonstrated a dignity in adversity that was perhaps more admirable than his tactical brilliance had ever been. He never begged for charity, never compromised his principles for the sake of temporary safety, and never allowed the bitterness of defeat to transform him into the kind of broken man that exile so often created. The poison ring that became his constant companion during these final years was both practical necessity and philosophical statement. Crafted by Syrian artisans with the exquisite skill that marked all Hellenistic luxury goods, it appeared to be nothing more than an ornate piece of jewelry suitable to a man of his dignity and reputation. But hidden within its golden setting was a hollow chamber containing enough concentrated poison to ensure that its wearer would never face the humiliation of Roman chains, or the degrading spectacle of a triumph where enemies were paraded through the streets like exotic animals. The ring represented Hannibal's final assertion of control over his own destiny, his refusal to allow Rome the satisfaction of capturing the man who had caused them so much pain and fear. It was a soldier's solution to a philosopher's problem, the question of how to maintain dignity when all other options had been exhausted. The very existence of the ring spoke to the continuing reach of Roman power and the narrowing options available to anyone who had once challenged that power successfully. As the years passed and refuge became increasingly difficult to find, Hannibal's isolation became almost complete. The network of friends and allies that had sustained him through decades of campaigning gradually dissolved, victims of death, political necessity, or simple fear of Roman retaliation. Letters from the few supporters who remained loyal were intercepted by Roman agents, making communication dangerous for anyone who still wished him well. Yet even in these reduced circumstances, the old general continued to pose a threat that Rome could not ignore. His knowledge of Roman weaknesses, accumulated through 20 years of studying their methods, remained encyclopedic. His ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate diverse forces had not diminished with age. Most dangerous of all, his very existence served as a reminder that Roman power was not invincible, that the legions could be defeated, and that the empire had enemies who possessed both the skill and the determination to exploit any sign of weakness. The final hunt was beginning, and both predator and prey understood that it could end in only one way. Hannibal's hand would often stray to the golden ring that held his final option, while Roman agents moved through the eastern Mediterranean like patient bloodhounds following a scent that grew stronger with each passing season. Number 80, Echoes in Eternity. 400 words. As twilight settles over this ancient tale, and the last echoes of elephants' trumpets fade into the gentle silence of history, let us pause to consider the strange mathematics of legacy and the way that failure, sometimes, can be more powerful than success. Hannibal Barca, the man who swore to destroy Rome, became instead the chisel that carved Rome into the shape of eternal empire, teaching her the lessons that would make her invincible for 1,000 years. Picture the Roman mothers of generations yet unborn, hushing their restless children with whispered warnings, Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. The name that once struck terror into Italian hearts became a talisman against complacency, a reminder that greatness must be constantly defended and that enemies could emerge from the most unexpected directions. Roman senators, debating policy in their marble halls, would invoke his memory whenever discussion turned to existential threats, understanding that eternal vigilance was the price of continued dominion. The irony is almost too perfect to be accidental. The boy who placed his small hand on a sacred stone and swore eternal enmity to Rome became, through the very magnificence of his failure, one of Rome's greatest teachers. His tactical innovations were absorbed into Roman military doctrine, his strategic principles studied in Roman academies, and his example used to inspire Roman generals who faced their own impossible odds in distant lands. The crossing of the Alps became a metaphor for achieving the impossible, while Cannae provided the template for perfect tactical execution that every commander dreamed of replicating. Even now, more than 2 millennia after his death, Hannibal's story resonates with anyone who has carried the weight of family expectations, who has struggled to fulfill promises made in youth, or who has discovered that personal vendettas can consume entire lifetimes. His journey from oath to exile speaks to the eternal human themes of ambition and duty, love and hatred, the sweet poison of revenge, and the way that our promises define us long after we have forgotten why we made them. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you will dream of distant mountains where elephants walked through snow, of morning mist rising from ancient lakes, of the sound of bronze on bronze and battles that decided the fate of civilizations. Let Hannibal's ghost be your companion in these peaceful hours, whispering the eternal truth that all great stories teach us, that our choices echo through time, that courage matters even in defeat, and that sometimes the most perfect revenge is simply being remembered when empires have crumbled into dust and legend is all that remains of our ambitions. Sleep well, and remember,